This is so much better than what we have in the classrooms and our lectures, which they look like they're the size of Buicks, and that's how you know the difference between top and bottom. Yeah. Well, thank you all for coming. This is our last teaching seminar of the fall semester, and the attendance is outstanding, and I think I really want to give, is Laura here with her group hidden somewhere? I want to thank Laura for at the last minute letting me off the hook, because apparently I wasn't smart enough not to schedule 3 events at the same time at this time, and the brown bag lunch group is over here today instead of listening to me over there. So it's a better trade-off with this group here. What we've tried to do this semester, I think successfully, is to sort of broaden the appeal of this seminar. It was very math-centric before, but I think a lot of us are realizing it needs to be a little more STEM-centric at times, and the issues come across very well to all the different disciplines. So in support of broadening that, we've tried to form some alliances, which we'd like to continue to make with some of you folks. And one of our best alliances with the Center for Excellence in Science Education. And so Jackie and I have talked, and we brought together things that we thought appealed to a broader group. Last month we did incivility in the classroom, which appeals to everyone on this planet. And this semester, this particular talk today was also co-sponsored by Jackie. And so I want to share the announcement part of this, and I asked Jackie if she'd be willing to introduce our speakers today, and Jackie never says no to anything, so I'm going to pass this to her.
So hello, everybody. I can't tell you how excited I am to have Carla and Peggy here today. I've had the pleasure of working with both of them, and I learn something every time I'm with them. So for those of you who don't know Peggy, she is a faculty member in the College of Education. She holds a PhD in human development and with a specialization in educational psychology. And she has taught me so much about learning, and I still, every time I'm with her, I feel like I'm just glued to everything she has to say. And Carla just finished her PhD with Peggy, so they make a dynamite team. I had the opportunity to work with both of them over the past year. They were developing a course for our Millennium Science program, the Bridge program, in a STEM learning course. So that's really what prompted me to think there's a much broader audience that needs to know what these two people have to say. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce, I think Peggy is going to lead off, and then Carla is going to take over.
Okay, so I'll get my microphone set. Okay, so as Jackie told you, Carla and I are both educational psychologists. And so what I want to do is to explain to you, apparently I'm not coordinated, explain to you what that means and how that influences what we're going to talk about here today. So as educational psychologists, what Carla and I do is we study how students learn, how students solve problems. So when we are thinking about things that are going on in the classroom, we are thinking about them from the perspective of what's going on in the learner's head. How is the learner interacting with the material and learning? And so what happens is that as we go out, and I should also share with you that most of the research that we've done in the recent years have been with STEM faculty here on the Penn State campus. So we've had a number, I'm looking at 2 of the folks I've worked with in chemistry before, Barbara DeHart over in biology. We've also worked with a number of folks in engineering. So the kinds of things that we are going to be talking to you about today are issues that have come up as Carla and I have worked with STEM faculty across this university. And what we were asked to address today are myths that faculty like yourselves hold about students' learning processes. Now, what do I mean by myths is that these are false beliefs that influence our instructional practices. So beliefs we have about what students can and can't do and the ways in which they do those that then influence the things that we do in the class. Now, in fairness to all of you, I'm calling them myths. But the truth is, I don't think that they're things that you explicitly believe. That is, as we put these up here, I think you'll find that these are things that if we were to ask you directly, is this true? I think you would probably recognize, at least in most cases, no, that's not true of students. But the reality is these beliefs continue to have an implicit influence on our actions. So what we want to do today is to address 3 of those. We want to bring those out, be explicit, and talk about those. We want to talk about some things that we can do to address those, ways in which we can change our instruction to better align with what we know about students' learning. So we're going to share some tips as we go along through those. All right? So that kind of gives you the intro. We've got actually an activity that we would like for you guys to work on. So we're going to pass out this activity packet. Half of you are going to get these blue ones. Half of you are going to get the orange ones. When you receive your packet, what we want you to do is take a few minutes and just work through, go 1 page at a time, answer all the questions on each page, go to the next one. Do not discuss what you're doing with anybody else. It's a secret. And then as we go through, we'll be able to tell you about what the meeting, we'll be referring to this as we go throughout, all right? And media site people, if you can hear me, this is where you should be using your downloads, right? They got them? Get started. Okay, so I think most of you have been able to finish up the packets, and what I'd like for you to do is just hang on to them. As I said, we're going to refer to those as we go throughout the presentation today. There'll be occasion for you to look back at them. But right now, what I want to do is to move us on to talking about our first myth, and that myth is stated here. It's that students can comprehend and use visualizations. Now, I want you to be able to understand what I mean by visualization. So on the next few slides, I'm going to show you some examples. These are examples that have been taken from a variety of classes. You might not see any that look just like what you have in your classrooms, but while you're looking at these, I want you to think about what sorts of similar visualizations do students encounter and the kinds of teaching that you do. So we see some examples here. You can see that there's a pretty wide variety, but what we mean by visualizations is that these are essentially nonverbal representations. One of the things we know about these nonverbal representations is that they are very prevalent in all of the STEM disciplines. Students are encountering these kinds of things all over the place. Teachers use them in lecture. They are in the students' textbooks, in their lab books. They're being used in support of worked examples, like what we see in a lot of mathematics classrooms. They're being used to present experimental findings that students are supposed to be interpreting. So we're using visualizations to convey meaning in a lot of different places, a lot of different ways. But if we're going to do that, we should probably stop and ask the questions, can students actually understand these visualizations? And when I'm using the word understand here, what I am talking about is basic comprehension. Can students read them? I don't mean can they get some deep conceptual understanding of the content area, just basic comprehension processes. So to talk about that, that issue, or that question, I want you to think about that activity 1. So this is the set of 3 multiple choice questions that you had to answer in relation to the diagrams. And you think about those a little bit. Now, first of all, I do want to apologize because I know you got these mass copied and the resolution on them wasn't great. But these 3 items that you answered actually come from a 34-item diagrammatic reasoning measure. And we used this measure with some students here at Penn State. And when they were answering the questions, these were actually being shown on a high-resolution computer screen. So some of the struggles you had would have been cleared up for them. Now, where we use these items, recently with this study that I did with John Waters, and for those of you who don't know John, he teaches over in the biology department here. And so we gave this measure to students as part of a larger study we were doing. We had 310 students from one of John's class complete these 34 items. So the students that we want to talk about today or focus on are students just like the ones that you have in your classes. These are Penn State students. We had a range of majors, but predominantly these students came from science and engineering majors. And for the most part, they were freshmen and sophomores. Some exceptions to that. So we want to take a look at the 3 questions that you answered and realize that our students answered those questions also. And as we do that, I want you to stop and think about these 2 questions I've put up here. So just how hard do you think those diagram reasoning items were, right? And along with that, I want you to think about, is it reasonable for us to expect the average college student to be able to understand those? Realizing, of course, that students are encountering visualizations just like this in all of the instructional material that they're encountering, okay? So let's take a look at how do Penn State students do on those 3 questions that you answered. All right, so question number 1 is this one. They've got this text over on the side, and then they've got the diagram, the picture of the 2 skulls with a caption under it, and they're asked a better figure title for figure 20 would be what? And the answer, the best answer to this is option A, 2 Neanderthal skulls. And when you think about this question, it's really actually a pretty easy question. The answer is given right there in the text where it states their skulls are massive and refers to figure 20. It's also stated right there in the picture caption, right? So to answer this question, I don't know, how many of you got it right? Right? So some of you, right? It's answer A is the right option, but in fairness, I wonder if those of you who didn't get it right, if you picked either C or D, because those are also sort of arguably reasonable options that you might make, right? But how many of our Penn State students got the right answer? How many do you think? What percentage? Take a guess. 30%? 14. And let's add C and D. Let's make the argument C and D are not unreasonable. Let's add that. A full 64%, right? Now, right? Option B, not correct. Neanderthal versus modern human skulls. Now, why do students struggle with this? You know, I said the answer's right there. It's given in 2 places. Why is this so hard? Well, what the students are actually being asked to do here is to have to map words onto a diagram. And what we find, not just at Penn State, this is true institutions across the world, it turns out that this is a really difficult task for students to do. So think about how often they encounter that sort of thing in instructional material, and we assume it's sensible to them. Okay, so while 14%, go ahead, Neil.
So is it, I mean, don't you think a lot of students just think, well, when there's a diagram with 2 skulls, it's just going to be a comparison? I think they just, partly they just assume that.
Well, so if that's what they're doing, then we better start thinking about how to correct that, right? Because they're clearly not going to get the right meanings out of this. And I wonder with this one also, and I see we got a lot of questions, but I want to make sure that do we want to do questions in the middle? We want to. I'm a little worried about time, so I'll respond to that. But I think perhaps what a lot of students were doing, they didn't even bother to read this. They just looked at the diagram. Oh, it looks to me like one of these looks more Neanderthal than the other. It must be a comparison, and they moved on, right? If that's what they're doing, that's a problem. Right? That kind of superficial inspection, and we see this across the board, superficial inspection of visualizations. Us as instructors believe they are there for a reason. They convey important meaning. Students aren't looking at them, and they aren't thinking about them. Okay? So,
just for your time management here, we just put 12:30 because that's when the students are coming.
okay. But we'll be able to go along. So, and I'm hoping that we get a chance to do a lot of discussion when we're done. I think one of the challenges in doing this is that we were trying to be general enough to fit everybody. But I think afterwards we'll be able to get a lot of questions that help us drill into specifics of different classes. Okay, so let's look at the next question. This one has the 2 cross sections. The students are asked what the main difference is between them. The correct answer for this one is answer option C. And when we look at how our students did, they did a little better on this one than the last one. 44% of the students correctly answered option C. Still not half, right? So we're still under half of the students. Now, to think about what might be going on here, why so many students got it incorrect, let's look at the next most frequent option they selected. And you see that's option A. 30% of the students selected option A. Option A says that corn has ground tissue, but buttercups have cortex and pith, right? Well, look up here at the part I highlight in yellow, right? That's clearly showing us that buttercups do actually have ground tissue. What's happening here is that the students don't know how to use that convention that we use consistently to label structures and diagrams, right? It's not the only convention students struggle with. I'm a bit behind time, so I'm going to move through this one pretty quickly. But this is one where you're supposed to look at waves, and I know your resolution might not be good enough to see this, but what they're supposed to look at are these arrows here, the interior arrow for P wave, here to here, and then here to here, while the S wave goes all the way out here, right? So S wave is the correct answer. 67% of the students got that. So that's a little more encouraging. But almost a quarter of the students had it the other way around. They struggle with the conventions of the arrows. And again, we see this in research at institution after institution. Students don't know how to interpret the arrows that we use in a variety of kinds of visualizations. Okay? Now, I could go on and on and on, lots of other examples to show you the struggles that they have, but I think that this is enough to sort of give you a sense. What's going on here is that we are asking students to learn new content from these visualizations, but they can't understand the visualizations themselves. Now, the examples I used that I showed you here show us students struggling with text diagram connections and some specific diagram conventions. Those aren't the only places where we see these struggles happening, right? These are just examples. We also have research evidence to show that students struggle with animations. They don't know how to read and follow those. Students have great difficulty mapping one visualization or connecting one to another, transforming any kind of visualization, and interpreting diagram signs like colors and keys. And some of these latter points are extremely important to mathematics. When you think about, do you guys talk about the rule of 4? Verbal, numeric, graphic, geometric representations, this math ed thing. Different representations used in mathematics to convey meaning. And to really understand the meaning, students have to know how these things relate to each other. Extremely difficult, and students really struggle with it. Now, on top of that, I've been talking here about provided visualizations, but we know that we also sometimes find ourselves in positions where we want students constructing visualizations. They have to make their own graph, they have to make their own table, they have to make their own model or drawing. We find that students really struggle with that as well. If they can't comprehend them, we shouldn't be surprised that they can't make them. So this brings us back to the statement of the myth. I think you can see why I believe that this is a myth. We present these visualizations to students, but they're having a hard time with them. So what can we do about that, right? Because these visualizations still remain central. Avoiding them is not a good idea. So what might we do? The things I would suggest would be, first of all, to embed a variety of visualizations within your instruction. So use them a lot. Put them out there. There is some data, some really interesting studies that were done in physics by a couple of guys who studied what happened in physics classrooms where instructors increased their use of visualizations that they were like putting on PowerPoints or whatever and explicitly talking about. And what we find is that this increases students' ability to understand visualizations and to be able to use and be flexible about them. So embed a lot in your instruction. Along with that, use explicit instruction to teach visualization comprehension. What I mean by that is you've put the visualization up there. Rather than just starting to talk about the content in it, also spend some time talking about how to read it. If you think, for example, about like that one with the arrows, the shadow zones. So what I'm saying is point at those and say, this is how we interpret arrows in diagrams like this. Okay? So we teach those kinds of things. Now, if we've done 1 and 2, that puts us in a good position to move to 3, which is to ask the students to explain what it means, right? So I've got my shadow zones up there. I've taught students what arrows mean. And now I'm going to turn to you, and I'm going to say, So you tell me what we can learn about those shadow zones from this. Get the students working on, so maybe they will start paying more attention to them, okay? So I know I'm real tight on time, so I'm going to turn over and let Carla start to talk now. Whoops, I forgot my restatement, the revised statement, right? We know that we need to help students with these visualizations.
Okay, so now we're moving on to the next myth, and this is myth number 2. For myth number 2 of student learning, what I have noticed and what I have experienced most frequently for student myths among faculty is that many faculty believe that students are able to generate connections between things that are related. So for example, in many classes, faculty expect students to be able to take what they learn in class on Tuesday and be able to connect that to what they learn in class on Thursday. They also expect that students are able to generate these connections across the entire semester, as well as with classes they've previously taken, prerequisites and so forth, and to the class that they're taking currently. This is not necessarily what happens. So, I guess I'm getting some appreciation here. So for example, in a biology anatomy class, many times the class is taught by teaching human systems one at a time sequentially throughout the entire semester. So they'll start maybe with the endocrine system, and they'll progress through the cardiovascular system, the pulmonary system, the urinary system, and it's the human body. So we know that all of these systems interact with each other, and they all have cause and effect relationships with every other system in the body. But many students aren't able to generate these connections automatically. So let's consider activity number 4. So activity number 4 was the activity in which you solved a problem about medical radiation. So I wasn't sure exactly how familiar you guys were with the content, but this is a similar study, or this study has been done by Gick and Holyoke, utilizing undergraduate psychology students. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the results from you, as well as the results from the undergraduate students who've also answered this question. So there are many, many possible solutions to this radiation problem. Gick and Holyoke found that there's generally 3 themes that the responses will fall into. The first theme here is avoiding contact between the rays and the healthy tissue. So for example, some students respond by describing how a surgical procedure should be done to actually create an incision in the stomach to expose the tumor and actually apply the radiation directly to the tumor without affecting any healthy tissue. That's one general response. The other is that some students suggest that you could alter the tumor's sensitivity to the rays. So by giving a patient some medication that might make the radiation target the tumor, or a vaccination to the healthy tissue so that the healthy tissue is less susceptible to the radiation. That's one general theme. The third one is the one we're most interested in here today, and that's reducing the intensity of the rays as they pass through the healthy tissue. So here we have an example of a student response according to this theme. What this response describes is taking rays from various angles and shooting them so that they all converge onto the point of the tissue of the tumor. So that you would have the highest intensity at the tumor while each surrounding healthy tissue doesn't get that much of the radiation. What's cool, if you may or may not be familiar, is that there is current technology that actually utilizes this procedure. The CyberKnife system, as pictured here, basically shoots the rays from various angles so that they eventually converge onto the site of the tumor in a very precise manner. Now, let's briefly move on to activity 2. Activity 2 you did prior. Everybody read this. This was on the dictator and the general. So, in this story, what you read is how a general is trying to overthrow a dictator who is situated in the fortress of a city who looks like this. Now, mind you, this is the Arc de Triomphe, and that's not the story. That's not the city I'm describing in the story. It is a fictional story, but you get the idea. So here, the general solves the problem by taking the troops and separating them so that there's only small troops that go down each one of these roads so that they converge in the center point of where the dictator is to overthrow the dictator. In this case, I call this the, no, I can't remember. The divide and conquer, yes. The divide and conquer solution, excuse me. So the divide and conquer solution is what is going on here. Now, what do you think about this and this? Any connection? Well, what we find is that students who respond to the radiation problem without reading a prior text or any manipulation whatsoever, they will come up with the divide and conquer solution 10% of the time. However, how do you think that changes when participants or students read the dictator and the general solution first? Do you think they're able to recognize the connections between the two and be able to increase the likelihood of being able to generate? Before we answer that question, I'd actually like to see, take a poll. Let's take a poll. So, I'm going to tell you in a minute, all of you have read the dictator and the general prior to solving the radiation problem, but there was one little thing different between the two of you. So, those on this side of the room, or with the blue sheet of paper, raise your hand if you came up with a divide and conquer-ish solution to this problem. Raise your hand real high so I can see. Excuse me. No. Who came up with a similar solution, like the converging on the central point to the radiation problem? Very, very few, maybe 10%, probably very close. Now, on this side of the room, the orange sheet, how many of you guys actually came up with a similar divide and conquer radiation converging? Wow. That's pretty exciting. I had no idea what to expect. All right, so all right. Okay, so here's the difference. Half of you guys got a hint. Guess which half? The orange people got a hint. So for the orange people, they received a little hint right before answering the radiation problem. And they were told, go back, or at least think, about one of the previous stories you've read and see if that will help you solve this problem. Just that little hint right there. The other half did not. There was no reference to problem one, no reference whatsoever. So, very much like you, what we find is that undergraduate students who are given a hint make the connection. 92% can make the connection when they're given just a little hint. 20%, very, very, very few, just above the fact that those who didn't even read the story at all had 10%. So, quite big differences right here. So what we see here is that this is not the case. Students are clearly unable to generate connections between things that are related unless they're given support. So here, I have 3 tips that I would like to cover that might be able to help you. So the first one is utilizing surface features to your advantage. So what I mean by surface features are wording, word choice, picture choices, so that we can make the map and the match more clearly. So in a past study that I've done, I had students read correlation text. And in the correlation text, it described and defined what a correlation was. So here's an excerpt right here. A correlation describes the relationship between 2 variables. So in this case, then participants received a psychology text. The psychology text was split. half of the participants received a psychology text with an exact match on wording, so they had relationship and correlation, and the other half received the exact same text without those words, and synonyms were used instead, so link and connection. What I found is that participants who read the text that had the same surface features, they were able to make the connection and recognize that in the psychology text, it was describing a correlation, and they used the information that they learned from the correlation text in their solution to the psychology text example. That was not the case for those who read the same text that didn't have the match for surface features. So the tip here is to really be careful with your word choice. Make sure that you can use words that are very clearly words that are familiar to the students, and don't use synonyms interchangeably without making that clear to the students, because they're not able to recognize the connections without you explicitly making them. So, additionally, you need to draw attention to the connections, just like in the activity that we did here, by making it explicit and saying, use what you learned in class on Tuesday to help you with this, or putting a hint on the exam, or a quiz, perhaps, maybe not the exam, but giving them hints and telling them how they connect, where they connect, and being explicit about it in your lectures, in your activities, and all throughout your class will be able to make them generate these connections. And finally, you can also use activities to act as a forcing function. Sometimes we find that even though we tell students to generate the connections, they still can't. And that may be because they don't know how, or they don't know exactly what to generate the connection between. So in that case, one of my other studies that I've completed was also in the biology system. So here I gave students two texts, one about the urinary system and one about the endocrine system. When I told students to make the connection, they weren't able to do so without additional support. So I needed to provide them with this exercise here, in which case they filled out this worksheet while they were working through reading the text, in which case they could see the connections explicitly between the two systems as they went through reading the materials and studying them. I also asked them explicit questions after they were done reading that asked them to generate what types of connections they saw between them. So students were able to generate the connections when they were asked and when they were given support to generate them, but not when they were told to without having the additional support. So in this case, what we find is that students who are given the necessary support and are able to succeed in generating these connections, they're able to generate them, but they need some help from you as the instructor to work through and be able to help them and tell them where these connections occur, at least in the early stages of learning, so that you can have them eventually, they need them less as they know more and more about the content area. And so that is myth number 2.
Okay, so while I'm hooking myself up here and getting us started, I will make a connection for you. Something to point out, to think about is, so Carla's talking about explicit features overlap, right? And previously I was talking about representations, visualizations. Those visualizations are something you could think about as leverage to make these explicit connections. So if the graphic that you use in one class looks the same as a graphic that's used in another class, it's much easier for students to go, oh, I've seen that thing before. I know what that thing means. So you can think about how you can kill 2 birds with 1 stone there. And in a minute, I'm going to give you a 3rd bird you can kill with the same stone. We're all about efficiency. Okay, so myth number 3 that I want to talk about today is this statement that active learning is effective learning. You might be a bit surprised by that I'm putting that up as a myth, because how many of you in this room have been told to use active learning? Active learning is a good thing, right? We're putting that all over the place. Well, I'm calling it a myth. And for us to think about why I'm doing that, I want you to turn your attention to activity 3, I think it was, the one that came between the two Carla was talking about. It starts with the paragraph starts, the procedure is actually quite simple. First you gather together, et cetera, okay? And then you have these questions down here at the end. What is the paragraph about? Main idea and rate the difficulty. So first of all, what I want you to do, I'm going to do the same thing Carla did. I'm going to give you the answer to what is the paragraph about. And I want to see how many of you got it right, okay? Our blue packet people on this side, our orange packet people on this side. This passage was about doing laundry, okay? How many of you, by show of hands, how many of you got something related to doing laundry or washing clothes? See how smart these guys are, right? Now, here's the interesting thing. It's a little unfair for me to ask that question because they were kind of given the answer, in truth. If you had an orange packet, you actually saw, whoops, I'm sorry, I'm pressing the wrong button. You actually saw this title at the top, right? Doing laundry. So they saw this title, Doing Laundry, and then you read the passage, and then I asked, what's it about? So a little unfair for us to focus on the first question. I want to know, when you gave these ratings down here, how difficult was this passage to understand? How many of you, show of hands, how many of you gave it a rating of either a 1 or a 2? It was easy or it was very easy. But you got to put your hands up high so we can see. How many 3s? Add the 3s to it. So really still doing laundry, people thought it was still hard? That's interesting. You never know. I'm sorry, what? I couldn't hear what you said. Different? It felt kind of weird? Oh, indifferent. Indifferent. Okay. So how many of you did a 4? It's like an indifferent. This was, you know. Poorly written. Right. Well, okay. So let's think about our students, right? How many times are our students reading in their textbook or reading through some instructional material and they're thinking, wow, this is just poorly written, right? This doesn't make any sense to me. This is just poorly written. The interesting thing here is that our blue packet people, right? So orange packet people were given the title, but all we had them do was just read. And that looks like what we would call pretty passive activity compared to what we are told to do, engage learners in active learning. So our blue packet people, I had to do something active. I gave you an activity. For those folks, what they had to do was to create a flow chart, identify the procedures involved, set it up as a flow chart, right? And what we find is that relative to our more passive looking, just read the material, this doesn't help you understand anything, right? Now, the passage we've used here actually comes from some research that John Bransford and colleagues have done, and you can demonstrate with college students all over the place the same phenomena we see here. Give them the title, just ask them to read it, and it makes sense. Take the title away, ask them to do whatever you want, and they'll still struggle with it more. So if the blue packet people are our active learners, and active learning is good learning, then how can that be? Well, let's take a look at what's going on. I want you to think about this issue here, right? So we got active learning. Active learning's good, right? Well, the problem is that active learning usually gets translated to mean doing something. And by doing something, we end up interpreting that to mean some external activity. Make a flow chart, carry out an experiment, concept map, whatever. Do something. Well, that external activity is not what we want. Good active learning is going to involve some internal activity. We're talking about active in the head. People who were reading that laundry passage with the title, you were active in your heads, so it made sense. We couldn't see you move and we couldn't see you do anything, but you were being active. So I want to give you some depth to really thinking about this. So I want to back up a little bit and talk about 3 basic learning principles that underlie what's going on here. So our first principle you see is that learning is about the generation of connections. So if you look at this little depiction I've got here, our circles, those are concepts. The lines that we have here are connections. These connections between concepts are stored in long-term memory, and then it's the pattern of these connections that affect how we can remember and use information on down the road, right? So when we're talking about active learning, We are talking about the active construction of connections, okay? So if active construction of connections is what we want, we should probably ask, how do they get there? How do we construct them? That goes to principle number 2. We say that connections are formed when concepts are thought about at the same time. Okay. Now, thought about, what we're referring to here is this thing called working memory or short-term memory you might have encountered in the past. So working memory is this place where concepts are active, where our learner is thinking about them. And what we find is that connections are generated between concepts when those concepts are active in working memory together. So our orange packet passive readers, when you were reading that passage, you had this knowledge about laundry active in your mind at the time that you're reading the passage. And then you're able to generate connections between that prior knowledge and what you were reading to be able to make sense of what was coming in. Okay? So we want this kind of activity. But there's a catch, and that's principle number 3. This is that working memory has limited cognitive resources. What we mean by this is attention. Okay, so attention is what we talk about as those resources. Attention means the concepts that you're thinking about now, right? So it's just the same way, you know, your mom used to say, pay attention, or your teacher said, pay attention. It means the same thing, right? What concepts are you attending to right now? Those are the concepts active in working memory. What we know is that attention is limited. You can only think of so many concepts at the same time. So our orange packet people, they've got the title, they're doing this great job, they're thinking about laundry, they're reading what they're doing, it's all making sense, they're generating connections. But then what happens when some extraneous concepts come along? And we ask them to start thinking about things like make a flow chart or whatever the case might be. It pushes those relevant concepts right out. Okay? If those relevant concepts aren't in working memory, you can't generate connections with them. Okay? So let's think about how that basic principle plays out in an active learning kind of environment. I'm going to skip the next slide for the media site people. You can move along. I want to start up here. I'm going to give you an example. Don't tell John I'm picking on his cat dissection in a biology lab, but that's the example I'm going to use. You can imagine all those kids are up there dissecting cats. We've got our giant-headed learner here. And what she's trying to do is she is trying to find the renal artery. She's in the midst of this dissection trying to find the renal artery. She's doing a good job, okay? She's attending to the important concepts. We got her thinking about the aorta, the aortic arch, and so on. But what happens is that she gets down here, is she's going through her cat. She's down here to the splenic artery, and all of a sudden, she encounters something. This something doesn't look like it belongs there. And she's thinking, I wonder if that's some excess connective tissue that I should be removing. And she says, yeah, I think it is. I think it probably is. And then it's like, oh, no, man, my scalpel's not in my my tool tray. My scalpel, where'd my scalpel go? And now she's looking around for that. She finds her scalpel. She finally got it, and then she goes, oh, that's right. There was that special way we're supposed to hold on to this so that we make careful cuts and we don't ruin the specimen. And you know what's going on here? We got this stuff moving up here, and the concepts she's supposed to be learning about have moved down here. She's not attending to the key concepts anymore. She's lost track of them. And once that has happened, we know she can't be making connections with them anymore, right? So what has happened is our activity has a lot of distractions involved in it, okay? And that brings us back full circle to my statement of the myth. Now, by calling this a myth and by picking on cat dissection, you might start to think that, oh, you know, she's telling us not to use active learning. Am I suddenly hearing active learning is a bad thing? Well, no, you're not. I do still think active learning is a good thing. You should continue to think about how to use it and where to use it. But what we want to do is we want to think about how to design these activities so that they are as effective as they can be. So I'll share some tips. First of all, design your activity to reduce extraneous attention-draining processes, right? So prep materials in advance, or have the students do all that prep in advance. Don't have them cutting up pieces of paper or whatever it is in the middle of when they should be thinking about other stuff, all right? One example, for instance, is don't use those fancy computer programs when paper and pencil would do just fine, okay? Remember graph paper? It actually still works. Begin the activity with a clear statement of the objective. Tell students, why are we doing this? This is what you should be attending to. Tell them what the important concepts are. Make sure they know that before they start. Then while they're doing the activity, provide some attention directing supports, right? Some things that can help pull them back to where they were. So go back to our biology student, right? And then she finally found her scalpel, and now she cuts it away, and then she's like, oh, crap. What was I supposed to be thinking about again? Well, one of the things we know from those biology labs is that sitting right next to her is going to be a diagram that's going to tell her what those keep, right? And it can pull her right back to this was what I was supposed to be doing. So think about the supports like that that can be embedded in the activities, okay? And then finally, in the activity with a debriefing, right? When they're done, come back to it. Remind them of what the objective was. This is what you were supposed to pay attention to. This is what you were supposed to get. So many times we talk to students, and they tell us that they end these great activities that were designed completely confused about what the point was. Right? Make sure that we don't leave them on that note. Okay? So that brings us back. I'm sorry, I skipped my myth slide, but we'll go straight to the revision. I would revise the statement to more accurately state active learning is effective learning when the activity directs attention to key concepts. Okay? So make sure you keep that in mind. That brings us to the end of all this stuff. And Carla and I are hoping that we have some time to talk with you. So I'm just going to, I'm actually going to skip the first one altogether. I want to talk about the don't throw the baby out with the bathwater point. What I mean by that is that folks like you are busy, and you have better things, or I shouldn't say better, you have other things to be doing right now. But instead you came here. And if you are spending this amount of time thinking about your teaching, I suspect you've already got some really good things going on in your classroom. What I would encourage you to do is to just take the things we've talked about today and think about how you can use those to tweak some of the activities that you're already doing to kind of strengthen and improve the way that those are working. And then finally, you know, we've got some general tips here because we knew we were going to have a broad audience, so there's not much specifics in terms of the recommendations that we've made. Carla and I are happy to talk, brainstorm some of those with you, but we know specifics tend to be tied to the context that you're in, so some that we can bring up through discussion because, you know, it's pizza time. So we can talk while you eat. We thank you all for your time, for your attention today. Hope this has been helpful. And we'll talk to you some more after you get your food, I think is the plan. Is that right?
We do appreciate you taking